So I'm at least a third generation of Indian descent that was born. My parents were also born in South Africa,
Mm.
and so you know the maybe I start off by saying very simply there were basically four distinct racial groups in South Africa, and based on that racial categorization, you enjoyed power or you didn't enjoy power and
Mm.
privilege. So right at the top of the ladder, maybe of hierarchy, I should say, you would have the white population. As I said, was less than 10% of
Mm.
the population. So a very distant second, or maybe even I go there. Only whites had the right to vote. Only whites had the economic power, military power, everything. Only to the whites, right?
Mm.
Very distant second, you would have the colored group, and the colored was the mixed race group between
Okay.
the black and the white, right? And they, at best, they were about 3 million, but and a very distant, a very close third were people of what we call Asians or Indians,
Mm.
where we were the third. But the very distant last, even from the third to the fourth, very big gap was the so-called blacks, or we call them Africans,
Mm.
because at a certain time in the history of South Africa, in the struggle for freedom, the coloreds, Indians, and Africans, we considered ourselves black because we were not white and we had no rights like whites had. So, but Africans are the, and I'll refer to them as blacks because most people understand them as blacks, right? The biggest population, the most disadvantaged, the most discriminated against in every aspect of what you can think about. And let me explain what I mean. You had separate residential areas called the Group Areas Act. So every racial group had to live in a separate group area. Whites took over 80% of the land. They deprived everybody of the land, right? 87% of the land was, for whites.
Mm.
And it was a criminal offense for one racial group to be living in another area of a racial group of another area. You were contravening the Group Areas Act, which was a criminal offense. And then you had you had the Prohibition Against the Mixed Marriages Act. That was the name of the law.
Wow.
The
Wow.
Prohibition Against the Mixed Marriages Act. The
Couldn't
act
get any
name
clearer,
speaks
right?
for itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, Rupesh, they had the Immorality Act. The Immorality Act is not just not marrying somebody of a different race, but having any relationship, a sexual relationship in particular, you would be contravening the Immorality Act and you would be prosecuted and jailed. So those were the big, and then big apartheid. Of course,
Mm.
because we lived in different areas, racialized areas,
Mm.
our schools were segregated as well. So we only went to schools designated for your particular racial group, right?
Mm.
And the amount of money spent on the education of a white child was at least more than 10 times the education spent on the education on a colored or Indian child,
Wow.
and pennies for an African child,
Mm. Mm.
because it was the stated policy of the government that the blacks were not to be educated because they were meant to be slaves to their white
Mm.
masters. This was said in Parliament, right?
Mm.
I
Mm.
mean, I mean that was so blatant. So the Constitution was, in such a way that it was racial discrimination,
Mm.
and every other law on the books. But one of the most offending pieces of legislation for Africans, especially, was what they call the pass laws, PASS laws,
Okay.
pass laws. It prohibited them from moving from one area to another area without a permit. Now, by the way, the Indian residential schools system, or the Indian Act rather, although it didn't have the pass laws, it had the practice of pass laws. And in a similar way, Indians, sorry, I should say indigenous peoples,
Yes.
although the Act talks about Indians,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't want to confuse, right? They were not allowed to leave the reserves without special permission.
Mm.
In a similar way, the South Africans actually borrowed the Indian Act in establishing the apartheid system.
Okay.
And so the past laws was such an egregious piece of legislation that people were banished. Well, let me also back up to say there were so-called homelands or reserves created in remote parts of the country for different tribes of the African tribes.
Mm-hmm.
Zulus in Zululand, for
Mm.
example, right? And so that's where they were banished to, but their males were required as laborers, so they had to come, as laborers to the cities.
Sure.
But their families were, of course, separated. And so, if their families wanted to visit them or come and see them, they
Mm-hmm.
were breaking the law and they were jailed.
Mm.
Millions of people were
Wow.
criminalized.
Yeah.
Millions and millions of people were criminalized. Sometimes just looking for a job in a different area than what they were supposed to be. In 1960, March the 21st, 1960, there was a peaceful civil disobedience organized in a place called Sharpeville.
Mm-hmm.
That's a township, in fact, where my clients came from,
Mm-hmm.
Sharpeville. It's a black township, about 60 kilometers south of Johannesburg.
Okay.
They arranged a peaceful protest and a civil disobedience for the passes. They were going to have a bonfire and burn their passes. Police lost their heads. Although this was peaceful, unarmed crowd,
Mm-hmm.
they shot into the crowd. They massacred people. 69 people were massacred on the spot. Subsequent reports of autopsies showed that most of them were shot in the back. Hundreds were injured. And there was a world outcry about that. And the isolation of South Africa started slowly. The boycott of South Africa, kicked out of the Commonwealth of
Mm.
Nations, and other boycotts that followed over the decades, to the extent, of course, that in 1994 Mandela became the first democratic elected president.
Mm-hmm.
So growing up in South Africa was difficult because we didn't
Mm.
have all the amenities. We did the best we could, with the resources that we had. But I can only speak mostly for the Indian community and my parents and my family. They were not people of means.